The silver wedding band slipped from Eleanor Hawthorne's trembling fingers and rolled across the dusty floor of the Cherry Creek, Nevada general store, coming to rest against a barrel of salted pork. She stared at it for a long moment, this symbol of a marriage that had ended 6 months ago when fever took her husband Thomas, then bent to retrieve it with hands that bore the permanent marks of her grief. The scars that crisscrossed her palms and fingers were thick and raised, souvenirs from the fire that had consumed their homestead 2 years before, the same fire that had taken everything except her life and Thomas's. Now even he was gone, and she was alone in a town that didn't quite know what to do with a widow who worked leather better than most men. It was late September of 1878, and the heat of summer still clung to the Nevada territory like a stubborn memory. Eleanor tucked the ring into her pocket and finished gathering the supplies she needed, salt and thread and a length of good rope. The storekeeper, Mr. Chen, nodded to her with the quiet respect he showed all his customers, taking her coins without comment. He'd seen her hands before, seen the way other townspeople sometimes stared or whispered, but he never said a word about it. That was one of the things she appreciated about Cherry Creek. It was small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, but big enough that a person could still find pockets of privacy if they looked hard enough. She stepped out into the afternoon sun, adjusting the wide-brimmed hat that had once belonged to Thomas. The main street was bustling with the usual traffic of wagons and horses, miners coming down from the silver claims in the hills, ranch hands heading to the saloon, women in their good dresses visiting the seamstress. Eleanor kept her head down and her scarred hands tucked against the bundle of supplies, making her way toward the edge of town where she'd set up her small leather working shop in a shed behind the boarding house where she rented a room. The sound reached her before she'd gone 20 paces. The distinctive ring of hammer on anvil, steady and rhythmic, coming from the blacksmith's forge across the street. She'd heard it 1,000 times in the 6 months since she'd arrived in Cherry Creek, but she'd never actually gone inside. She had no horse that needed shoeing, no tools that required mending. She bought what she needed from the general store and kept to herself, focusing on the leather work that kept food on her table and a roof over her head. She made saddle bags and holsters, belts and bridles, anything that required skilled hands and patience. The scars didn't matter when it came to the work. If anything, they'd made her hands stronger, less sensitive to the rough texture of the leather and the sharp needles she used for stitching. But today something made her pause. Maybe it was the loneliness that had been pressing down on her shoulders like a physical weight. Maybe it was the way the sunlight caught on something metal in the forge's doorway. Maybe it was just fate, though Eleanor had stopped believing in fate the day Thomas died. Whatever the reason, she found herself crossing the street, dodging a wagon loaded with timber, and stepping into the shadowed interior of the forge. The heat hit her first, radiating from the furnace in waves that made the air shimmer. Then her eyes adjusted, and she saw him. The blacksmith stood with his back to her, working a length of iron with focused intensity. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair damp with sweat, his leather apron streaked with soot. His arms were bare below the rolled-up sleeves of his shirt, and she could see the play of muscle as he brought the hammer down again and again, shaping the glowing metal with practiced precision. "Be with you in a moment," he called without turning around, his voice deep and carrying easily over the ring of his hammer. Eleanor almost turned and left. She had no real reason to be here, no business to conduct. But something kept her feet planted on the packed earth floor, kept her watching as he worked. There was something hypnotic about it, the way he moved, the way he seemed to know exactly how much force to use, where to strike, when to return the piece to the fire. Finally, he plunged the iron into a barrel of water, and steam hissed up in a great cloud. He set down his hammer and turned, wiping his hands on a rag. That was when Eleanor got her first real look at his face. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30 or 32, with strong features and dark eyes that held a certain wariness. But it was his hands that caught her attention as he tucked the rag into his belt. Even in the dim light of the forge, she could see the scars that covered them, thick and ropey, crisscrossing his palms and running up his forearms. Burns, she realized. Old burns that had healed badly, leaving their permanent mark. "What can I do for you, madam?" he asked, and there was a gentleness in his voice that surprised her. Lena realized she was staring. "I'm sorry, I don't actually need anything. I was just passing by and I heard the sound of your work." He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to her hands where they clutched her bundle of supplies. She saw the moment he noticed her scars, saw something flicker in his expression. But it wasn't pity or disgust. It was recognition. "Those look like fire scars," he said quietly. Eleanor's first instinct was to hide her hands, to make some excuse and leave. But something about the way he said it, without judgment or curiosity, just a simple statement of fact, made her pause. "They are. From 2 years ago, our homestead burned." "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. Then he held up his own hands, palms out, showing her the full extent of his scars. "Mine are from 8 years back. I was working at a forge in California, and there was an accident with the furnace. Burned my hands and arms so bad the doctor said I'd never work iron again." "But you did," Eleanor said, looking around at the forge, at the tools hanging neatly on the walls, at the evidence of skilled craftsmanship everywhere. "Took me 2 years to learn how to hold a hammer again," he admitted. "But I'm stubborn." He smiled then, and it transformed his face, made him look younger and more open. "Name's Peter Garrison. I've seen you around town, but we've never been properly introduced." "Eleanor Hawthorne," she replied, and before she could think better of it, she extended her right hand. Peter stepped forward and took it, his scarred palm pressing against hers. His grip was firm but gentle, careful not to squeeze too hard. And then he did something unexpected. He turned her hand over, studying the pattern of scars with serious attention, then looked up at her with those dark eyes. "We match," he said softly, and there was something in his voice that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. For a long moment, they stood there in the heat of the forge, hands clasped. Two people marked by fire and loss, recognizing something in each other that went beyond words. Then Eleanor gently pulled her hand back, suddenly aware of her racing heart, of the way her cheeks felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "I should go," she said, her voice coming out more breathless than she'd intended. "I have work to finish." "Of course," Peter said, but he didn't move, didn't look away. "Mrs. Hawthorne, would you perhaps consider coming back sometime? I'd like to hear more about your story if you're willing to share it. It's not often I meet someone who understands." Eleanor hesitated. Every instinct told her to decline politely, to keep her distance, to protect the fragile equilibrium she'd built for herself since Thomas's death. But there was something about Peter Garrison, about the way he'd looked at her hands without flinching, about the simple statement, "We match," that made her want to say yes. "Maybe," she said finally, "if I find myself with free time." "The forge is open from dawn until dusk, 6 days a week," he replied. "You'd be welcome any time." Eleanor nodded and turned to leave, but at the doorway she paused and looked back. Peter was watching her, and when their eyes met, he smiled again. She found herself smiling back before she could stop herself, then hurried out into the afternoon sun, her heart pounding in a way it hadn't in a very long time. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Eleanor tried to focus on her work, cutting and stitching a new saddle bag for one of the local ranchers, but her mind kept wandering back to the forge, to Peter's scarred hands holding hers, to the way he'd said we match with such quiet certainty. She told herself she was being foolish. Thomas had only been gone 6 months. It was far too soon to be thinking about another man, especially in any way beyond simple friendship. And yet she couldn't deny the connection she'd felt, that immediate sense of understanding that had passed between them. That night, lying in her narrow bed in the boarding house, Eleanor stared at her hands in the moonlight that filtered through the thin curtains. She'd spent 2 years hating these scars, seeing them as a constant reminder of everything she'd lost. The fire had taken their home, their possessions, their carefully planned future. It had left her and Thomas with nothing, forcing them to start over in a new place. And then the fever had taken Thomas, and she'd been left truly alone, marked by tragedy in a way that set her apart from other women her age. But Peter had looked at her scars and seen something different. He'd seen a match, a shared experience, a point of connection rather than a source of shame. The thought made something unfurl in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. 3 days passed before Eleanor found herself walking back toward the forge. She told herself she was just being neighborly, that there was nothing wrong with making a new friend in town. But she'd taken extra care with her appearance that morning, pinning her dark hair more carefully, choosing the dress that was slightly less faded than the others. She felt nervous in a way she hadn't felt since she was 16 and Thomas had first asked to walk her home from church. The sound of the hammer guided her steps. Peter was working at the anvil again, this time shaping what looked like a door hinge. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him work. In the days since their first meeting, she'd found herself paying more attention to the products of his forge. The iron work around town bore his mark, she realized. The sturdy railings outside the bank, the decorative hinges on the church doors, the hooks and brackets that held up signs along the main street. All of it showed the same careful craftsmanship, the same attention to detail. "Are you going to come in or just stand there watching?" Peter's voice carried over the ring of his hammer, but there was amusement in it rather than irritation. Eleanor stepped inside, feeling the heat envelop her. "How did you know I was here?" "Saw your shadow," he replied, setting down his hammer and turning to face her. His face was streaked with soot, and there was a smudge on his forehead, but his smile was genuine and warm. "I'm glad you came back. I thought about what you said," Eleanor admitted, moving closer, "about understanding. I've spent the last 2 years feeling like I was the only person in the world who carried these marks. It's strange to realize that's not true." Peter nodded, wiping his hands on his apron. "When I first got burned, I thought my life was over. I was 24 years old and everything I'd worked for was gone. My hands were my livelihood, and the doctors said I'd be lucky if I could feed myself, let alone work a forge again." He held up his hands, looking at them with an expression that was part resignation, part pride. "But pain has a way of teaching you what you're made of. How did you do it?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. "How did you learn to work again?" "Slowly," he said with a slight laugh, "and with a lot of failure. The first time I tried to hold a hammer after the burns healed, I dropped it immediately. The weight was too much and my hands didn't want to close properly. But I kept trying. I'd practice for 5 minutes, then 10, then 20. I built up the strength and flexibility bit by bit. It took 2 years before I could do a full day's work." "That must have taken incredible determination," Eleanor said softly. "Or incredible stubbornness," Peter countered. "I wasn't always sure which." He gestured to a rough wooden bench against the wall. "Would you like to sit? I could use a break, and I'd like to hear your story if you're willing to tell it." Eleanor settled onto the bench, smoothing her skirt over her knees. Peter grabbed a second stool and sat facing her, giving her his full attention in a way that made her feel both nervous and valued. She found herself telling him about the homestead, about how she and Thomas had been building their dream piece by piece, about the night the fire started, how fast it spread, how she tried to save their possessions and had gotten trapped in the bedroom when a burning beam fell across the doorway. "I don't remember much after that," she said, looking down at her hands. "Thomas pulled me out somehow. My hands and arms were burned, my hair was singed. The doctor in the town where we lived said I was lucky to be alive, but at the time I didn't feel lucky. I felt destroyed." "But you healed," Peter said gently, "and you learned a trade." "Thomas taught me leather working while my hands were healing," Eleanor explained. "It gave me something to focus on besides the pain, and after a while I realized I was good at it. The scars made my hands less sensitive, which actually helped with some of the rougher work. By the time we moved to Cherry Creek, I could make a living at it." Her voice dropped. "Thomas died 6 months after we arrived. Fever took him in 3 days." "I'm sorry," Peter said, and the simple sincerity in his voice made Eleanor's eyes sting with unshed tears. "The worst part is feeling like I'm alone with it," she admitted. "The grief, yes, but also the scars. People look at me differently. Women at church invite me to their sewing circles, but they always stare at my hands. Men treat me like I'm fragile or damaged. It's exhausting." "I know exactly what you mean," Peter said. "When I first came to Cherry Creek 2 years ago, people didn't think I could do the work. They'd bring their business to the forge reluctantly, expecting poor quality. It took months to prove myself." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "But Eleanor, you're not damaged. You're marked, yes, but that's different. These scars mean you survived something terrible. They mean you're stronger than the fire that tried to break you." The words settled into Eleanor's heart like seeds in fertile soil. She'd spent so long seeing her scars as a source of shame that she'd forgotten they could be seen any other way. "How do you do that?" she asked. "How do you stay so positive about it?" "I didn't used to be," Peter admitted. "For a long time after the accident, I was bitter and angry. I blamed everyone and everything. It took meeting someone who refused to see me as broken that started to change my thinking." He paused, a shadow crossing his face. "My mother. She was the one who believed I could work a forge again when no one else did. She died a year before I moved here, but I think about her every day. I work to honor her faith in me." They talked for over an hour, the conversation flowing easily from one topic to another. Eleanor told him about growing up in Missouri, about her childhood dreams of adventure that had led her to marry Thomas and head west. Peter told her about learning the blacksmith trade from his father in Pennsylvania, about the excitement and terror of moving to California to make his own way. They discovered they'd both lost parents young, both had to learn resilience early. They talked about books they'd read, places they wanted to see, small joys like the taste of fresh peaches in summer and the smell of rain on dusty ground. Finally, Eleanor stood reluctantly. "I should get back to my work. I have a commission to finish. Would you come back again?" Peter asked, rising as well. "I've enjoyed talking with you more than I can say." "I'd like that," Eleanor said, and realized she meant it completely. Over the following weeks, Eleanor found herself making regular visits to the forge. Sometimes she'd stop by in the morning on her way to the general store. Other times she'd come in the late afternoon when the day's heat was starting to fade. They'd talk while Peter worked, or during his breaks when he'd sit with her on the bench and share stories. Eleanor learned about his favorite foods, his dislike of loud noises that reminded him of the furnace explosion, his secret dream of one day having his own ranch with horses. Peter learned about her love of thunderstorms, her talent for sketching, her complicated relationship with her older sister back in Missouri, who told her marrying Thomas was a mistake. The people of Cherry Creek began to notice. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house, mentioned with studied casualness that Peter Garrison was a good man, steady and reliable. The seamstress, Miss Chen, commented that it was nice to see Eleanor smiling more often. Even Reverend Matthews found a moment after Sunday service to tell Eleanor that healing came in many forms, and sometimes the Lord worked through unexpected friendships. Eleanor knew what they were all hinting at, and part of her wanted to protest that she and Peter were just friends, nothing more. But that would have been a lie. With each conversation, each shared smile, each moment when their eyes met across the forge and understanding passed between them, she felt herself falling. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She'd loved Thomas deeply, and losing him had nearly broken her. The thought of opening her heart again, of risking that kind of pain, made her want to run and hide. But when she was with Peter, when he looked at her with those dark eyes that saw straight through to her soul, she couldn't imagine being anywhere else. It was mid-October when Peter asked her to dinner. "Nothing fancy," he said. "Just a meal at the boarding house where they could sit and talk without the heat and noise of the forge." Eleanor said yes before she could overthink it, and then spent the entire day in a state of nervous anticipation. She wore her best dress, a deep blue cotton that brought out her eyes, and pinned her hair up carefully. Her hands shook as she fastened the small silver earrings that had been her mother's, the only piece of jewelry she owned besides her wedding ring. The ring. She stared at it for a long moment, this symbol of a love that had ended too soon. Then, slowly, she removed it from her finger and placed it in her jewelry box. Thomas would always hold a place in her heart, but he was gone. And she was still alive, still capable of feeling, still deserving of happiness. It was time to stop living in the past. Peter was waiting in the boarding house dining room, wearing clean clothes and looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. When he saw her, his expression transformed into something that made Eleanor's breath catch. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you," Eleanor replied, feeling her cheeks warm. "You look very handsome." Mrs. Patterson had outdone herself with the meal. There was roasted chicken with herbs, fresh bread, vegetables from the garden behind the boarding house, and apple pie for dessert. But Eleanor barely tasted any of it. She was too aware of Peter sitting across from her, of the way his knee accidentally brushed hers under the table, of the way his eyes kept finding her face as though he couldn't look away. After dinner, they walked together in the cool evening air. The main street was quiet, most people already home for the night. A thin crescent moon hung in the sky, and stars were beginning to emerge. Peter offered Eleanor his arm, and she took it, feeling the solid warmth of him beside her. "Eleanor," he said after they'd walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, "I need to tell you something." Her heart began to race. "What is it?" "I'm falling in love with you," he said, stopping and turning to face her. "I've been trying not to because I know you're still grieving your husband, and I don't want to rush you or make you uncomfortable. But I can't keep it inside any longer. From that first day when you walked into my forge, I've felt connected to you in a way I've never felt with anyone else. These hands that I thought made me unmarriageable, you looked at them and saw a match. You saw me, the real me, not just the scarred blacksmith. And I see you the same way, Eleanor. I see a woman who is brave and strong and beautiful, inside and out. Your scars don't diminish you. They're part of your story, and your story is remarkable." Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "Peter, I'm scared. I loved Thomas so much, and when I lost him, I thought I'd never recover. The idea of loving someone again, of risking that kind of loss, it terrifies me." "I know," Peter said gently, reaching up to wipe away her tears with his scarred thumbs. "I'm scared too. But Eleanor, isn't it better to love and risk loss than to shut yourself away from feeling anything? We both know how fragile life is. We've both faced death and survived. Doesn't that mean we should embrace whatever happiness we can find?" "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "Yes, it does." She took a shaky breath. "I'm falling in love with you too, Peter. I've been trying to deny it, trying to tell myself it's too soon, that I'm betraying Thomas's memory. But the truth is, my heart is choosing you, and I think Thomas would want me to be happy. He wouldn't want me to spend the rest of my life alone." Peter pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. Eleanor buried her face in his chest, breathing in the scent of him, metal and smoke, and something uniquely him. They stood there under the stars, two scarred souls finding comfort in each other's embrace. When Peter finally pulled back, he cupped her face in his hands and looked at her with such tenderness that Eleanor felt her heart might burst. "May I kiss you?" he asked softly. "Please," Eleanor breathed. His lips met hers gently, carefully, as though she were something precious that might break. But Eleanor didn't feel fragile. She felt alive, every nerve ending sparking with sensation. She kissed him back with growing confidence, her arms winding around his neck, her scarred fingers threading through his hair. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate until they were both breathless and clinging to each other. "Eleanor," Peter murmured against her lips. "My Eleanor." "My Peter," she replied, and knew it was true. Somehow, impossibly, she'd found love again. Not a replacement for what she'd had with Thomas, but something new and different and equally precious. They saw each other every day after that. Peter would close the forge early and walk Eleanor home from her workshop. They'd have dinner together, take evening strolls, sit on the boarding house porch and talk until the stars came out. On Sundays they attended church together, sitting side by side in the hard wooden pews, their scarred hands clasped between them. The whole town watched their courtship with approval, and not a little romantic speculation. Eleanor felt herself blooming under Peter's attention. The grief and loneliness that had weighed her down for so long began to lift. She smiled more, laughed more, engaged with her neighbors in a way she hadn't since Thomas's death. Her leather-working business thrived as people sought her out not just for her skill, but for her renewed warmth and energy. She took on an apprentice, a young girl named Sarah, whose parents had died in a mining accident, teaching her the trade just as Thomas had taught her. Peter was equally transformed. The wariness that had marked his features when Eleanor first met him melted away, replaced by an openness and joy that drew people to him. His forge became a gathering place where men would stop to chat and share news. He began taking on more ambitious projects, decorative ironwork for the new hotel being built at the edge of town, elaborate gates for the cemetery, a weather vane in the shape of a running horse for the livery stable. His reputation spread, and people from neighboring towns began bringing him commissions. In December, the first snow fell on Cherry Creek. It was a light dusting, barely enough to cover the ground, but it transformed the desert landscape into something magical. Eleanor stood at her workshop window, watching the flakes drift down when Peter appeared in the doorway. He was bundled in his heavy coat, snowflakes caught in his dark hair, and he was carrying something wrapped in cloth. "Come with me," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. "I want to show you something." Eleanor grabbed her shawl and followed him out into the gentle snowfall. He led her to the forge, which was warm and welcoming after the cold outside. But instead of going to the furnace, he guided her to his workbench, where he set down the cloth-wrapped bundle and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was the most beautiful piece of ironwork Eleanor had ever seen. It was a heart, about the size of her palm, crafted with such delicate skill that it almost seemed to pulse with life. But what made her breath catch were the details. The surface was textured, marked with deliberate imperfections that looked remarkably like scars. And at the center, where the two halves of the heart would meet, Peter had worked in two sets of initials, PG and EH. "I made this for you," Peter said quietly. "I wanted to create something that showed how I see us. Two hearts marked by fire, coming together to make something whole and beautiful." He picked up the iron heart and placed it in Eleanor's hands. "Eleanor Hawthorne, will you marry me?" Eleanor looked down at the scarred iron heart cradled in her scarred hands and felt something break open inside her. This man, this wonderful, talented, loving man, saw her completely and chose her anyway. He'd taken the marks that others saw as flaws and transformed them into art, into beauty, into a symbol of their love. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with tears. "Yes, Peter, I'll marry you." He let out a whoop of joy and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until they were both laughing breathlessly. Then he set her down and kissed her with a passion that made her toes curl in her boots. When they finally broke apart, both flushed and grinning, Peter pulled a small box from his pocket. "I have something else for you," he said, opening it to reveal a silver ring. It was simple but elegant, with a small blue stone set in the center. "I know it's not fancy, but I made it myself." The silver came from a claim up in the mountains, and the stone is turquoise from a trader who passed through town. "I wanted you to have something I'd created with my own hands." Eleanor held out her left hand, watching as Peter slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, settling into place like it belonged there. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Perfect." They were married 2 weeks later in the small wooden church at the center of Cherry Creek. It was a simple ceremony, attended by what seemed like the entire town. Eleanor wore a new dress made by Miss Chen, cream-colored with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Peter wore his best suit, looking impossibly handsome and slightly nervous as he waited for her at the altar. As Eleanor walked down the aisle, she felt Thomas's presence like a warm wind at her back. Not sad or accusatory, but approving, giving her his blessing to move forward into this new life. She smiled through her tears as she took Peter's scarred hands in her own, listening as Reverend Matthew spoke about love and commitment, about two people joined together by God and witnessed by their community. "Do you, Peter Garrison, take Eleanor Hawthorne to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Peter said, his voice strong and sure. "And do you, Eleanor Hawthorne, take Peter Garrison to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Eleanor replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Peter, you may kiss your bride." Peter cupped Eleanor's face in his scarred hands and kissed her gently, sealing their vows before God and the assembled witnesses. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers. Mrs. Patterson was weeping openly into her handkerchief. Even Mr. Chen, usually so stoic, was smiling broadly. The reception was held at the boarding house, with tables set up in the large common room and spilling out onto the porch. Mrs. Patterson had organized a feast, with contributions from seemingly everyone in town. There was music and dancing, toasts and laughter. Eleanor danced with Peter until her feet ached, held close in his strong arms, feeling happier than she'd ever imagined possible. Late in the evening, when the celebration was winding down, Peter pulled Eleanor aside. "Are you ready to see your wedding present?" he asked with a mysterious smile. "I thought the iron heart was my wedding present," Eleanor said, confused. "That was my proposal gift," Peter corrected. "This is something different. Come on." He led her outside where a wagon waited. They climbed up, and Peter took the reins, guiding the horses down the main street and out toward the edge of town. Eleanor nestled against his side, content to let him surprise her. After about 15 minutes, they turned off the main road onto a smaller track that led up into the hills. "Peter, where are we going?" Eleanor asked, curiosity getting the better of her. "Patience," he said with a grin. They crested a small rise, and Peter pulled the horses to a stop. "Close your eyes," he instructed. Eleanor obeyed, and she felt the wagon move forward a bit more before stopping again. "Okay, you can look now." Eleanor opened her eyes and gasped. Before them stood a small house, newly built, with a porch that wrapped around the front and sides. It was simple but well constructed, with glass windows that caught the moonlight and a solid door with iron hinges that she recognized as Peter's work. Beyond the house, she could see the dark shapes of a barn and what looked like a workshop. "You built this?" she asked in amazement. "With some help from a few friends," Peter admitted. "I've been working on it for 2 months, ever since I knew I was going to ask you to marry me. I wanted us to have our own place, somewhere we could build our life together. The house is small now, but I designed it so we can add rooms as we need them. The barn can hold horses if we decide to get some, and the workshop is set up for your leather working. You'll have your own space to create, with better light and more room than that shed behind the boarding house." Eleanor turned to look at him, tears streaming down her face. "Peter, this is incredible. I can't believe you did all this." "You deserve a home," Peter said simply. "A real home, not just a rented room. Somewhere we can put down roots, raise a family if we're blessed with children, grow old together. I want to build a life with you, Eleanor, a good life, full of love and work and simple happiness." "I love you so much," Eleanor said, kissing him fiercely. "So much." "I love you too," Peter replied against her lips. "Come on, let me show you inside." The interior was just as impressive as the exterior. Peter had built sturdy furniture, a large bed frame, a table with chairs, shelves, and cabinets. There were even curtains at the windows, which Eleanor suspected Mrs. Patterson had helped with. The kitchen area had a good stove and plenty of counter space. The main room was spacious and open, with a stone fireplace that would provide warmth in the winter. There were 2 additional rooms, currently empty but ready to be filled as their family grew. "It's perfect," Eleanor breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "Peter, it's absolutely perfect." That night, for the first time as husband and wife, they christened their new home. Peter carried Eleanor over the threshold, and she laughed with pure joy. They made love slowly and tenderly, learning each other's bodies, giving and receiving pleasure with generous hearts. Afterward, they lay tangled together in their new bed, skin pressed against skin, scarred hands intertwined. "I never thought I could be this happy again," Eleanor confessed softly. "After Thomas died, I thought my chance at love was over. I thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone." "I'm glad you were wrong," Peter said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I'm glad we found each other." "We match," Eleanor said, echoing his words from that first day in the forge. "We match," Peter agreed, squeezing her hand gently. They settled into married life with surprising ease. Peter continued to work at the forge in town while also beginning to build up his own workspace on their property. Eleanor moved her leather-working business to the new workshop, thrilled with the space and light Peter had provided. They fell into comfortable routines, sharing breakfast before heading to their respective work, coming together for dinner and evenings spent talking or reading or simply enjoying each other's company. The winter passed, then spring arrived in a burst of wildflowers and warm breezes. Eleanor discovered she was pregnant in late April, and the joy on Peter's face when she told him was something she'd treasure forever. He insisted she take it easy, hovering over her with concerned attention that was both endearing and occasionally frustrating. She had to remind him repeatedly that she was pregnant, not fragile, and perfectly capable of continuing her work. As her belly grew, so did their excitement. Peter began building a cradle in his spare time, crafting it from smooth wood and decorating it with delicate ironwork. Eleanor sewed baby clothes and blankets, her scarred fingers moving with practiced skill. They debated names constantly, never quite able to agree but enjoying the discussion nonetheless. Sarah, Eleanor's apprentice, proved invaluable during this time. She'd learned quickly and was now capable of handling most of the leatherwork commissions on her own. Eleanor found herself taking on more of a supervisory role, teaching and guiding while doing the lighter tasks herself. She paid Sarah fair wages and made sure the girl had enough to eat and a safe place to sleep. In many ways, Sarah had become like a younger sister to her. The baby came in early December, during a cold snap that left frost on the windows and a fire roaring constantly in the hearth. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Eleanor feared she wouldn't survive it. But Peter stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her brow, encouraging her with words of love and faith. Mrs. Patterson and the doctor attended, working together to bring new life safely into the world. When Eleanor finally heard the sharp cry of her baby, she wept with relief and joy. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, placing the squirming infant on her chest. "A healthy, strong boy." Eleanor looked down at her son, this tiny miracle, and felt her heart expand to hold a love she'd never imagined. He had dark hair like his father and eyes that would eventually settle into some unknown color. His little hands waved in the air, and Eleanor caught one gently, marveling at the perfect tiny fingers. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." Peter leaned over them both, tears streaming openly down his face. "He's perfect," he said in an awed voice. "Eleanor, he's absolutely perfect." "What should we name him?" Eleanor asked, looking up at her husband. Peter thought for a moment, then smiled. "What about Samuel? It means God has heard in Hebrew. Seems fitting since we've both been praying for a safe delivery." "Samuel Garrison," Eleanor tested the name. "I love it." Little Samuel proved to be a good baby, sleeping and eating on a fairly regular schedule. Eleanor threw herself into motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else, learning how to nurse and change and soothe. Peter was a devoted father, coming home from the forge eager to hold his son, walking the floor with Samuel when he fussed, singing off key lullabies that somehow worked to calm the baby. As Samuel grew from infant to baby to toddler, Eleanor and Peter's life together deepened and strengthened. They had their disagreements, of course. Peter could be stubborn about asking for help when he needed it. Eleanor sometimes got so focused on her work that she forgot to eat. But they always talked through their issues, always came back to the love and respect that formed the foundation of their marriage. The leather working business thrived. Eleanor's reputation spread far beyond Cherry Creek, and she began receiving commissions from people in other towns, even other territories. Sarah became a full partner in the business, her skills now rivaling Eleanor's own. Together, they hired 2 more apprentices, both young women who needed a trade and a steady income. Eleanor took pride in teaching them not just the craft, but also the confidence to stand on their own in a world that often underestimated women. Peter's forge work also flourished. He took on a young man named James as an apprentice, teaching him the blacksmith trade just as Peter's father had taught him. James had been injured in a mining accident and walked with a permanent limp, but he was strong and eager to learn. Peter saw something of himself in the young man, that determination to overcome physical limitations through sheer force of will. When Samuel was 3 years old, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and the labor, while still challenging, went more smoothly. They welcomed a daughter in the spring, a small but fierce baby girl with Eleanor's dark eyes and Peter's strong features. They named her Rose after Peter's mother. Life with 2 small children was chaotic and exhausting and wonderful. Samuel adored his baby sister, wanting to help with everything from feeding to diaper changes. Peter built an addition onto the house, creating separate bedrooms for the children and a larger living space for the whole family. The property began to look more established, with a proper garden, a chicken coop, and eventually a few horses that Peter bought from a rancher whose prize mare he'd reshod. The years passed in a blur of work and family, of challenges overcome and joys celebrated. Samuel grew into a bright, curious boy who loved helping his father at the forge. Rose was wild and free, always climbing trees or chasing chickens or getting into some kind of mischief. Eleanor and Peter watched their children grow with pride and wonder, marveling at the family they'd created. When Samuel turned 7, he asked about the scars on his parents' hands. Eleanor and Peter sat him down and told him the stories, explaining about the fires that had marked them, about the pain and healing that had followed. They told him how they'd met, how they'd recognized something in each other that went beyond surface appearances. "So your scars brought you together?" Samuel asked, his young mind trying to work through the concept. "In a way," Peter said. "The scars were part of our stories, and our stories led us to each other. But more than that, the scars taught us both that you can survive terrible things and still build a good life. They taught us to see beyond the surface, to recognize strength and beauty in unexpected places." "And that's how you knew you matched," Samuel said, remembering the story they'd told him. "Exactly," Eleanor confirmed, ruffling his hair. "We matched." As the children grew older, they began to understand the significance of their parents' story. They saw how people in Cherry Creek looked at Eleanor and Peter with respect and admiration. They heard the tales of how the scarred blacksmith and the scarred leather worker had found love and built a thriving life together. The story became part of the town's lore, told to newcomers as an example of resilience and hope. Eleanor and Peter became pillars of the Cherry Creek community. Eleanor served on the church committee and helped organize relief efforts for families struggling with hardship. Peter was elected to the town council, where he advocated for better roads and public works projects that would benefit everyone. Together, they modeled a partnership based on mutual respect, shared work, and deep love. When Samuel was 12 and Rose was 9, tragedy struck the town. A late summer storm rolled through, bringing with it lightning that sparked fires in the dry brush. One of these fires spread quickly, threatening several homesteads on the outskirts of Cherry Creek. Eleanor felt her old fear rising as she saw the smoke, remembered the terror of being trapped in flames. But Peter took her hand, squeezed it gently, and together they joined the effort to fight the fire. They worked through the night, hauling water, digging fire breaks, helping to evacuate families and livestock. Their scarred hands, which had once seemed like marks of weakness, proved to be assets. They could work longer and harder than most, their damaged nerve endings making them less sensitive to the heat and strain. When the fire was finally contained, 3 homesteads had been lost, but no lives were taken. The community came together to help the displaced families rebuild, and Eleanor and Peter were at the forefront of the effort. That experience brought everything full circle for Eleanor. She realized that the fire that had marked her all those years ago had not only led her to Peter, but had also given her the strength and compassion to help others facing similar tragedies. The scars she'd once hated had become a source of power, a visible reminder of what she'd overcome. The years continued their steady march. Samuel grew into a tall, strong young man who decided to learn both his father's trade and his mother's, becoming skilled in working both metal and leather. Rose remained wild but channeled her energy into learning to train horses, developing a reputation as someone who could gentle even the most skittish animals. Eleanor and Peter aged gracefully together, their love deepening with each passing year. They celebrated 20 years of marriage with a party that brought together friends from across the territory. 30 years brought grandchildren, as Samuel married a woman named Catherine and Rose found love with a rancher's son named David. 40 years brought retirement from daily work, though both Eleanor and Peter still spent time in their respective workshops, unable to completely give up the crafts they loved. Through it all, through joy and sorrow, triumph and setback, they remained each other's constant. They still held hands every night before falling asleep, scarred palms pressed together. They still took evening walks when the weather permitted, talking about everything and nothing. They still looked at each other with love and wonder, grateful for the chance meeting in a forge that had changed both their lives. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the whole town of Cherry Creek threw them a celebration. It was a warm June day, and tables were set up in the main street, groaning under the weight of food and drink. There was music and dancing, speeches and toasts. Their children and grandchildren surrounded them, 3 generations of family that had grown from that first moment of connection. Peter stood to address the crowd, his hair now silver but his eyes still sharp and warm. 50 years ago, I met a woman who walked into my forge and changed my life forever. Eleanor Hawthorne, as she was then, looked at my scarred hands and didn't see damage. She saw a match. She saw a possibility. She saw me, truly saw me in a way no one else ever had, and in that moment I knew my life would never be the same. He turned to Eleanor, who sat beside him with tears streaming down her weathered face. You've given me 50 years of love and partnership, of shared dreams and daily joys. You've given me children and grandchildren, a home and a purpose. You've shown me that scars don't define us, they simply tell our story. And our story, my love, has been better than anything I could have imagined. Eleanor stood and took Peter's scarred hands in hers, looking up at him with all the love in her heart. We match, she said simply, and the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. That night, after the celebration had ended and their family had gone home, Eleanor and Peter sat on the porch of the house he'd built for her so many years ago. The moon was bright overhead, and the desert stretched out before them, silent and peaceful. You have any regrets? Eleanor asked softly. Not a single one, Peter replied without hesitation. Only that we didn't have more time, Eleanor said. Even 50 years doesn't feel like enough. Then we'll have to make the most of whatever time we have left, Peter said, pulling her close. Just like we've made the most of every day we've been given. They sat in comfortable silence, these 2 people who had been marked by fire and found each other across a crowded forge. Their scars had brought them together, but their love had sustained them, growing stronger and deeper with each passing year. They'd built a life on a foundation of shared understanding, mutual respect, and unwavering devotion. And now, looking back over 5 decades of marriage, they could see the pattern clearly. Every joy, every challenge, every moment of doubt or fear or triumph had been worthwhile because they'd faced it together. Eleanor leaned her head on Peter's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," Peter replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Always and forever." The years that followed were gentle to them. They remained active in their grandchildren's lives, delighting in watching the next generation grow and thrive. Samuel's oldest son showed an aptitude for blacksmithing that thrilled Peter, while Rose's daughter inherited Eleanor's talent for leatherwork. The family business continued to prosper, now run by the second and third generations, but still bearing the marks of its founder's vision and skill. Eleanor and Peter's health remained remarkably good well into their 70s. They still took their evening walks, though at a slower pace now. They still worked in their shops when the mood struck them, though more for pleasure than necessity. They still held hands every night, still found reasons to laugh together, still looked at each other with love that had only grown deeper and more profound with time. When Peter turned 78, he decided to create one final masterpiece. He worked on it in secret over the course of several months, carefully crafting an iron sculpture that would serve as a permanent reminder of their story. When it was complete, he unveiled it at a family gathering. It depicted two hands clasped together, the surface textured with deliberate imperfections that resembled scars. At the base, he'd inscribed their names and the date they'd met, along with the simple phrase, "We match." "I want this placed in the town square," Peter announced, "so that everyone who comes to Cherry Creek will know that scars don't define us. Love does. So that anyone who feels broken or damaged will see this and know that they too can find connection and joy." The town council unanimously approved the installation, and the sculpture was placed in a place of honor in the center of Cherry Creek. It became a gathering place, a landmark, and a source of inspiration. Couples would come to touch the clasped hands and make wishes for their own relationships. Children would ask their parents about the meaning of the sculpture and learn the story of the scarred blacksmith and leather worker who'd found love against all odds. Eleanor and Peter lived to see their great-grandchildren born, tiny babies who represented the continuation of the family they'd built together. They watched as the world changed around them, as Cherry Creek grew from a small mining town into a proper city with new buildings and modern conveniences. They saw the turn of the century, entering the year 1900 with a sense of wonder at all they'd witnessed and experienced. In the early spring of 1901, Peter fell ill with pneumonia. Despite the best efforts of the doctor and his family's loving care, he didn't recover. Eleanor sat by his bedside day and night, holding his hand, telling him stories of their life together, reminding him of all the joy they'd shared. "I'm not afraid," Peter whispered to her one evening, his voice weak but certain. "We've had a good life, Eleanor, better than I ever dreamed possible. If it's my time to go, I'm ready." "I'm not ready to lose you," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. "You won't lose me," Peter assured her. "I'll always be with you, in our children and grandchildren, in the house I built, in the work we created together. You'll see my hands in every piece of ironwork around town, and you'll know I'm still here." He squeezed her hand weakly. "We match, remember? Even death can't change that." Peter passed away peacefully 3 days later, surrounded by his family. Eleanor held his hand until the very end, feeling the moment his spirit left his body. The grief was overwhelming, a tidal wave of loss that threatened to drown her. But she was not alone. Her children and grandchildren surrounded her with love and support. The entire town of Cherry Creek mourned with her, remembering the good man who had served them so well. They buried Peter in the cemetery, He'd made the gates for decades earlier, on a hillside overlooking the town. Eleanor stood at his graveside with her family gathered around her, looking down at the casket that held the man she'd loved for more than 50 years. She thought about the day they'd met, about his scarred hands holding hers, about his simple declaration that they matched. She thought about the life they'd built, the love they'd shared, the legacy they'd created together. "Thank you," she whispered to the wind, to Peter's spirit, to whatever force had brought them together all those years ago. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for every single day we had together." Eleanor lived another 3 years after Peter's death. She moved back to the house in town, unable to bear staying in the home he'd built without him there to share it. She continued to work in her leather shop when her hands permitted, taking comfort in the familiar motions, the connection to the craft that had sustained her through so many difficult times. She spent time with her family, delighting in her great-grandchildren, passing on stories and wisdom to the youngest generation. She often visited the sculpture Peter had created in the town square, running her scarred fingers over the iron hands, remembering. People would sometimes find her there, sitting on the bench nearby, lost in memories. Some would approach her, asking to hear the story behind the sculpture. Eleanor would smile and tell them about the day she'd walked into a forge and met a blacksmith who changed her life forever. She'd tell them about recognizing shared pain, about finding love in unexpected places, about 2 people marked by fire who built a life of beauty and purpose together. On a warm afternoon in late June of 1904, Eleanor sat in her rocking chair on the porch of her small house, looking out at the streets of Cherry Creek. She felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion and everything to do with a long life fully lived. She thought about Thomas, her first love, gone so many years now. She thought about Peter, her second love, her partner, her match. She thought about her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all the family that had grown from the seeds of love she and Peter had planted. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple, Eleanor closed her eyes. She felt a presence beside her, warm and familiar. When she opened her eyes, Peter was there, young and strong as he'd been when they first met, his scarred hands reaching for hers. "Are you ready?" he asked with that smile she'd loved for so long. "I'm ready," Eleanor replied, taking his hands. "We match." "We always did," Peter said, and led her into the light. They found Eleanor the next morning, still in her rocking chair, a peaceful smile on her weathered face. Her scarred hands were folded in her lap, and in them she clutched the iron heart Peter had given her when he proposed, all those decades ago. The entire town mourned her passing, but they also celebrated her life. Eleanor and Peter had shown them what was possible when 2 people chose love over fear, when they refused to let scars define them, when they built a life on foundation of respect and partnership and deep, abiding affection. They buried Eleanor next to Peter, their graves side by side on the hillside overlooking Cherry Creek. On their shared headstone, their children inscribed the words that had defined their love: "We match." And beneath it, the dates of their births and deaths, bracketing lives that had been marked by fire, healed by time, and ultimately defined by love. The sculpture in the town square remained, a permanent testament to their story. Generations of Cherry Creek residents grew up knowing the tale of the scarred blacksmith and the scarred leather worker, using it as inspiration in their own lives. The businesses they'd founded continued to thrive, passed down through the family, maintaining the standards of quality and integrity Eleanor and Peter had established. Their great-great-grandchildren would eventually scatter across the country, carrying with them the story of their remarkable ancestors. The house Peter built still stood decades later, renovated and updated but maintaining its original bones. The forge where they'd first met eventually became a historical site, preserved as a reminder of Cherry Creek's past. But more than the physical remnants, Eleanor and Peter's true legacy lived on in the lives they'd touched and the love they'd shared. They'd proved that scars don't have to limit you, that tragedy can be survived, that love can be found even in the most unexpected places. They'd shown that two broken people can come together to create something whole and beautiful, that matching wounds can become points of connection rather than sources of shame. Their story became legend, told and retold with each generation. And always at the heart of it was that moment in the forge when a blacksmith looked at a widow's scarred hands and said simply, "We match." Two words that changed everything, that opened the door to a love story for the ages, that proved beyond all doubt that sometimes the most profound connections are forged in the fire of shared experience. In the end, Eleanor and Peter's story was about more than just two people falling in love. It was about resilience, about choosing hope over despair, about finding beauty in imperfection. It was about building a life that mattered, creating a family that thrived, contributing to a community that remembered. It was about two souls recognizing each other across the void and deciding to build a bridge of love and understanding. They matched, those two scarred hearts. And in matching, they created something timeless, something that would inspire and encourage long after they were gone. They proved that love doesn't require perfection, that the marks we bear tell our stories, and that sometimes the best matches are between people who have been broken and healed back stronger. Their legacy was love, pure and simple, and it endured long after the last person who'd known them personally had passed away. The story of Eleanor Hawthorne and Peter Garrison, the scarred leather worker and the scarred blacksmith who found each other in a small Nevada town in the latter half of the 19th century, became part of the fabric of Cherry Creek's history. It was taught in schools, referenced in sermons, used as an example of what was possible when people refused to let their pasts define their futures. And always at the center of it was that iron sculpture in the town square, two hands clasped together, scarred but strong, separate but united, different but matched. We match. Two simple words that contained a universe of meaning, that bridged the gap between two wounded souls, that started a love story that would span more than half a century and create ripples that would be felt for generations. Two words that reminded everyone who heard them that we all carry scars, visible or invisible, and that those scars don't have to isolate us. They can connect us, if we're brave enough to show them, if we're open enough to recognize them in others, if we're wise enough to understand that true matching isn't about perfection, but about complementary imperfections. Eleanor and Peter's story was ultimately one of hope, of healing, of love triumphant. It showed that life after tragedy is not only possible, but can be rich and full and deeply satisfying. It demonstrated that second chances exist, that new beginnings can be just as beautiful as first ones, that the heart has an infinite capacity for love if we're willing to open it. And it proved, beyond any shadow of doubt, that sometimes the person who matches you perfectly is the one whose scars mirror your own, whose pain echoes yours, whose strength complements yours, whose heart beats in rhythm with yours across all the years you're blessed to share together.